Ever feel like you're walking through a minefield? But instead of explosives, it's hidden agendas and people vying for power.
Oh,
You're
absolutely.
not alone.
We've all been there.
That's why this deep dive takes us back, way back,
Back to the 16th century.
to Italy with Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince.
It's a book that's often misunderstood.
It's a guidebook for rulers, but what's surprising
Shocking, even.
is how relevant the advice it contains still is today, even for us modern strivers. You specifically requested this deep dive, so
And thank you for doing so.
of course. I have to say, Machiavelli's take on ambition, on strategy, and honestly, let's not beat around the bush, the art of wielding power.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from it.
No, he doesn't. It's fascinating. And I have to admit, a little unnerving.
Definitely. It makes you think.
It really does. But to really grasp his advice, we kind of need to understand the world he was living in.
Right, because Machiavelli wasn't just theorizing about power from some ivory tower.
Oh, no.
He was down in the trenches. He lived it.
He was a diplomat in the world of Italian politics, which, let's be honest,
Cutthroat is an understatement.
it was a time of constant backstabbing, constantly shifting alliances.
Talk about a high-stakes game. It'd be like playing chess, but the pieces keep switching sides.
Exactly. That was Italy in Machiavelli's time. In fact, he actually felt the sharp end of that himself. When the Medici family came back to power in Florence,
The ultimate power players in Florence at that time.
he ended up exiled.
Talk about a crash course in the fickle nature of power.
No kidding. And it's interesting, he actually dedicated The Prince to Lorenzo de' Medici.
Trying to get back on their good side, you think?
You know, it makes you wonder. But that dedication itself is very telling. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I have nothing more valuable than my knowledge of the actions of great men."
So he saw this book, The Prince, as the ultimate gift.
The ultimate roadmap to power.
Distilled from history, from what he had seen firsthand.
Exactly. So let's unpack this roadmap a little. One of the first things he does is break down the types of states, what he calls principalities.
Right, because not all power structures are created equal.
Right. So he talks about hereditary rule, which is pretty stable because, well, people are used to it.
It's the status quo,
But then you have these mixed principalities.
the ones you gain through conquest, new alliances, that sort of thing.
And those are a whole different ballgame.
Absolutely. Way more challenging, because you're dealing with people who, well, they might not like the new management.
They might be loyal to the old regime. They might have their own ambitions.
Or they might just hate change.
It's like inheriting a company where half the employees are planning a coup.
I've never worked anywhere like that, Chuckles.
Hopefully not. But to illustrate this, Machiavelli uses the example of Caesar Borgia.
Son of Pope Alexander VI, no less. Talk about a family dynasty.
And Borgia was, well, ambitious is an understatement. His goal was to unite all of Italy under his family's control.
And he was willing to use any means necessary. Military might, political maneuvering, you name it.
And Machiavelli seems, I don't know, impressed by his methods, particularly in the Romagna region.
Where he really consolidated his power.
But here's the thing, Borgia was betrayed, and he met a rather, shall we say, unfortunate end.
Yeah, not exactly the happy ending you'd expect, so maybe not the best role model after all.
Maybe not. And that's where Machiavelli's concept of fortuna comes in.
Often translated as fortune or luck.
But it's more about the unpredictable nature of events. It's that hand of fate that you can't control.
Things happen, even if you're brilliant, even if you're ruthless.
Sometimes it's about being in the right or wrong place at the right time.
And that's where virtue comes in.
Yeah, to counter that fortune.
You got it. And virtue isn't just virtue in the way we normally think about it.
It's not just being a good person.
No. For Machiavelli, virtue is more about your skill, your cunning, your adaptability.
Your ability to navigate those changing tides of fortune.
He uses this great analogy of a river. You can't prevent the flood, but you can build dams, you can dig channels.
Divert the flow. You're not just at the mercy of fate. You're prepared. You're resourceful.
You adapt.
Which brings us to, I think, the most infamous part of The Prince. How to acquire and maintain power.
This is where it gets really interesting.
This is where Machiavelli really throws us a curveball, because he argues that sometimes you need to be decisive, even if it means using force.
And he doesn't shy away from the tough questions. He even talks about cruelty.
And that's what we're going to dig into next time. So last time we were talking about Machiavelli's more, shall we say, controversial ideas.
The ones that make you raise an eyebrow a little bit.
Definitely. Like his stance on using force, even cruelty, to maintain power.
It's intense. And it's easy to misinterpret.
Right, because he's not saying go out and be cruel. It's much more nuanced than that.
It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. So how does he justify that?
Well, he argues that sometimes a swift, decisive act of cruelty.
That sounds counterintuitive.
Right. You'd think it would backfire.
It seems like it would cause more problems than it solves.
But he says that it can actually be the most merciful option in the long run.
Really?
Because it's about preventing further chaos down the line. Think about it like cauterizing a wound. It's painful in the short term.
But it prevents a worse outcome.
Exactly. It stops the bleeding, prevents infection.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
And to illustrate this, Machiavelli uses the example again of Cesare Borgia.
Our favorite Italian prince.
Right. So Borgia, he puts this governor, Romero d'Orco, in charge of the Romagna region.
Which was notorious for being unruly.
Exactly. And d'Orco, he does not mess around. He uses some pretty brutal tactics to establish order.
So it's effective, but at what cost?
That's the question. And here's the thing. Once things are stable, Borgia has d'Orco executed.
Executed
Publicly. Can you imagine the message that sends?
Talk about a power move.
Right. But it was a calculated move. Because by eliminating d'Orco, Borgia was essentially saying, look, I'm not down with excessive cruelty. The people, they've been living through chaos. They see d'Orco's brutality, then his removal.
They might see it as justice being served.
Exactly. Borgia uses force, then distances himself from it, appearing merciful while consolidating his power.
It's Machiavellian in the truest sense of the word.
Right. It's about strategy. It's not about being cruel for the sake of it, but as a calculated tactic, a means to an end.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand the logic.
And this leads us to, I think, the most famous question Machiavelli poses in The Prince.
Is it better to be loved or feared?
Bingo. And what's interesting is that he doesn't say fear is always better. Ideally, you want both.
To be loved and feared.
Right. But if you have to choose, fear, he argues, is the more reliable option. Because fear keeps people in line.
It's a powerful motivator.
Right. People might love you one day and turn on you the next if their circumstances change.
But fear is a bit more constant.
Exactly. It's about self-preservation. People won't cross you if they're afraid of the consequences.
It's a bit cynical, but I can see how it works.
It is. But remember, Machiavelli's writing from a place of experience. He'd seen firsthand how quickly things could change in the world of politics.
And how easily alliances could crumble.
Exactly. So a leader needs to be able to inspire fear when necessary. But he also talks about the importance of something else.
What's that?
Appearances. He has this great line, everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are.
Image matters.
More than we might realize. And he uses another great example from history, Pope Alexander VI.
Cesare Borgia's father.
The one and only. Now, Alexander VI, he cultivated this image of piety, of religious devotion.
He was the Pope, after all.
Right. But behind the scenes, he was a master strategist. He was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals.
So it's not enough to just hold power, you have to look the part.
In Machiavelli's world, absolutely. A ruler should project an image of virtue, of piety, even if they have to make tough decisions behind closed doors.
So it's almost like he's suggesting that there's a performance element to leadership.
Absolutely. Think of it like this. Machiavelli's not writing a self-help book on morality.
He's laying out a strategy for survival.
Exactly. And in the world he was living in, power was a zero-sum game.
You either had it or you didn't.
And if you wanted to keep it, you had to be willing to play the game, even if it meant a little bit of, shall I say, calculated hypocrisy.
So it's like understanding the theater of power.
Exactly, the importance of perception.
Because how you're perceived is just as important as your actual actions.
And this applies not just to individual rulers, but to entire states. And that's where Machiavelli's ideas about managing internal power dynamics come into play.
And that's what we'll dive into next time. So we've got these rulers. They need to keep an eye on the nobles. They need to keep the people happy.
It's a balancing act.
A delicate one, for sure. So how do they manage that? According to Machiavelli, of course.
Well, he says that a ruler needs to be willing to act against nobles who threaten their power.
Which makes sense. You can't have someone undermining your authority.
But at the same time, you don't want to alienate the entire nobility.
It's all about maintaining that balance.
Exactly. It's about strategic alliances, picking your battles.
Knowing when to assert dominance.
And when to show a little restraint.
And this actually ties into one of Machiavelli's other key points, avoiding hatred.
Right, because as he says, above all things, A prince must guard himself against being hated by the people,
So even if a ruler isn't universally loved,
which, let's be honest, most aren't.
avoiding hatred is crucial for staying in power.
It's about maintaining that sense of legitimacy, even if it's through fear
Because hatred, that's what breeds resentment.
and ultimately rebellion.
He uses the example of Nabis, the prince of Sparta.
Who managed to defend his city against both the Greeks and the Romans
And why was he successful?
because he had the support of the people.
It's fascinating how Machiavelli recognizes that a ruler's power ultimately comes from those they rule.
It's a very modern idea in a way.
For his time, definitely. Because remember, back then, most rulers believed their authority came from God.
That it was their divine right.
But Machiavelli saw it differently.
He saw the importance of the relationship between the ruler and the ruled.
And that's what makes The Prince so much more than just, a tyrant's handbook.
It's a study of power dynamics.
The delicate dance between a leader and those they lead.
And it's about understanding human nature, which, let's face it, hasn't changed that much over the centuries.
No, I think we're still driven by the same desires, the same fears.
Exactly. We want security, we crave power, we respond to incentives.
And that's why The Prince still resonates today.
Because even though the world has changed drastically,
I mean, we're not conquering city-states anymore.
right, but the fundamentals of power, they're still there.
So how do we, the everyday negotiators and strategists,
The ones trying to get ahead in the 21st century.
how do we apply these principles, these 500-year-old ideas?
Well, I think of The Prince like a guide to situational awareness.
It's like a user manual for understanding the world around us.
Exactly. Machiavelli gives us the tools to recognize power dynamics, to anticipate challenges, to adapt our approach.
It's not about being ruthless.
It's about being strategic.
Understanding the game of power and hopefully playing it ethically.
Take his advice about appearances, for example.
Fake it till you make it.
Not quite. It's about understanding how you're perceived and using that to your advantage.
Like in a job interview, you wouldn't show up in your pajamas.
Right. You present your best self, you highlight your skills and experience,
It's strategic self-presentation.
and it applies to so many areas of life. Teamwork, leadership, even family dynamics.
Recognize the power dynamics, the unspoken rules.
And navigate them strategically.
It's like Machiavelli's point about the nobles versus the people.
Knowing who holds the real influence.
Because sometimes it's not the loudest voice in the room,
It's the quiet strategist in the corner.
the one making the real decisions.
And that takes observation, strategic thinking.
Like a chess player, you have to be thinking several moves ahead, all of which requires a healthy dose of virtue.
That blend of skill, cunning, adaptability.
And let's not forget fortuna.
Because luck and timing, they play a role.
Even with the best strategy, some things are beyond our control.
But that's where virtue comes in. Being prepared to seize opportunities when they arise.
So The Prince isn't a guaranteed recipe for success.
But it is a framework for approaching challenges with open eyes.
With a keen sense of strategy and, most importantly, the willingness to adapt.
And it's up to each of us to use these insights responsibly.
Machiavelli gives us the tools.
Now we wield them. That's our choice.
A lot to think about. But before we go, any final takeaway for our listeners, especially given their interest in Machiavelli?
I think it's worth remembering Machiavelli's advice about boldness.
What's that?
It is better to be bold than cautious, for fortune is a woman who prefers to be wooed with audacity.
So don't be afraid to take risks.
Calculated risks, of course,
Informed by strategy and awareness.
but be bold. Seize those opportunities.
Love it. So to our listeners, how will you channel your inner Machiavelli? Not to conquer kingdoms, hopefully.
But to navigate your world, to achieve your goals.
That's something to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us.